In the winter of 1918, Finland had been independent for only a few weeks when the country suddenly split in two. Armed workers seized control of the south. Conservative forces rallied in the north, and within days the young nation collapsed into civil war. In frozen cities and snow-covered railways, Finns began fighting Finns, and the struggle would decide not only who ruled the country, but what kind of nation Finland would become. The Finnish Civil War was a short but deeply traumatic conflict that took place in the early months of 1918. Though it lasted only a few months, its causes stretched back many years, rooted in political tension, social inequality, and the dramatic upheavals that followed the collapse of the Russian Empire during the First World War. For Finland, the war was not simply a battle for political power. It was a moment when the young nation struggled to decide what kind of country it would become. To understand how Finland reached the point of civil war, it is important to begin with its position within the Russian Empire. For centuries, Finland had been part of the Swedish kingdom, but in 1809 it became a Grand Duchy under Russian rule after Sweden lost the territory to the Russian Empire. Despite being under the authority of the Russian Tsar, Finland retained a surprising degree of autonomy. It had its own laws, its own administrative system, and its own parliament. During the 19th century, Finland gradually developed a strong sense of national identity. Finnish language and culture were increasingly promoted, and intellectuals began to speak about Finland not simply as a province, but as a nation with its own history and future. Economic development slowly transformed society. Railways expanded, industries grew in cities, and a modern working class began to emerge. However, these changes also brought tension. As industrial factories expanded, many workers lived in crowded conditions and struggled with low wages. Meanwhile, much of the countryside remained dominated by wealthy landowners and large estates. Tenant farmers and agricultural laborers often had little security and limited political influence. These inequalities created resentment among poorer Finns, who began organizing labor unions and political movements demanding reform. At the same time, the Russian Empire began tightening control over Finland at the end of the 19th century. Russian authorities feared that too much autonomy might encourage separatism. Policies were introduced that attempted to reduce Finnish independence and integrate the region more closely with the empire. These efforts, known as the Russification campaigns, caused widespread anger among Finnish citizens across many political groups. By the early 20th century, political divisions within Finland were becoming clearer. On one side were conservative groups who wanted stability and gradual reform. On the other were socialist movements that represented workers and poorer farmers who demanded major social and political change. Then came the dramatic shock that reshaped the entire region. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed during the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and the imperial government that had ruled Finland for more than a century suddenly disappeared. For Finland, this created both opportunity and uncertainty. Without Russian imperial authority, Finnish leaders debated the future of the country. Should Finland remain loosely connected to Russia, or should it become completely independent? In December 1917, Finland declared independence. The new nation was born during a time of enormous instability. Russia itself was descending into civil war between the Bolsheviks and their opponents. Across Europe, the First World War continued to devastate societies. Inside Finland, political divisions grew sharper. The socialist movement had gained strong support among industrial workers and landless rural laborers. They believed independence should lead to a society based on social equality and workers' rights. Opposing them were conservative and middle-class groups who feared that socialist revolution might destroy social order and private property. Many of them supported a strong government that would maintain traditional institutions and prevent radical change. These competing visions for Finland's future soon led to the formation of rival armed groups. Workers and socialist organizations began organizing militias known as the Red Guards. Meanwhile, conservative groups formed their own military units called the White Guards. These forces gradually armed themselves, preparing for what many feared might become open conflict. As tensions escalated in early 1918, the fragile political balance collapsed. In January 1918, socialist leaders launched an uprising, declaring control over parts of southern Finland. At the same time, conservative forces mobilized their own army under the leadership of General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. Within days, the country had split into two opposing camps. The Reds controlled many industrial cities and southern regions where workers were strongest. The Whites held much of northern Finland, where conservative support was stronger. Finland had entered a civil war. Though the country was small, the conflict quickly became intense and brutal. Both sides believed they were fighting not only for power, but for the survival of their vision of Finland's future. The war would soon draw international attention and foreign intervention, turning the struggle into part of the wider turmoil spreading across Europe at the end of the First World War. For ordinary Finnish citizens, life changed almost overnight. Towns were divided by political loyalties. Families sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. The quiet northern landscapes of forests, lakes, and snowy villages were about to witness one of the most painful chapters in Finland's national history. By the end of January 1918, Finland had effectively split into two rival states. The socialist Red Guards controlled most of southern Finland, including the important industrial cities of Helsinki, Tampere, and Turku. These regions were home to large working-class populations that supported the socialist movement and believed the uprising would lead to a more equal society. Meanwhile, the conservative white forces controlled much of northern and central Finland. These areas were more rural, and support for traditional authority and property rights was stronger. The Whites established their headquarters in the city of Vasa on the western coast, where they began organizing a national army. At the center of the White leadership was General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a former officer in the Imperial Russian Army. Mannerheim had decades of military experience and quickly became the key figure responsible for organizing the White forces. Under his command, the Whites attempted to transform their volunteer militias into a disciplined army capable of defeating the Reds. The Red leadership, on the other hand, was less centralized. Their movement was rooted in workers' organizations and political committees rather than a traditional military structure. Although they controlled major cities and industrial resources, their command system was often fragmented. Some units were highly motivated and organized, while others lacked training and coordination. In the early weeks of the war, fighting erupted across railway lines, towns, and key transportation routes. Control of railroads became extremely important because they allowed troops and supplies to move quickly through the snow-covered Finnish landscape. Battles often centered on railway stations, bridges, and junctions connecting different regions. During the winter months, the cold conditions added another challenge to the conflict. Temperatures frequently dropped far below freezing. Soldiers marched through deep snow, and many battles were fought in forests or small towns surrounded by frozen lakes. The harsh environment made supply lines difficult and forced both sides to rely heavily on local resources. One of the earliest goals of the White Army was to secure the northern regions and push southward toward the industrial centers controlled by the Reds. Mannerheim believed that victory would depend on isolating the Red strongholds and gradually breaking their control over key cities. At the same time, international forces began to influence the course of the war. The global situation in early 1918 was extremely unstable. The First World War was still raging across Europe, and the Russian Empire had only recently collapsed during the Bolshevik Revolution. The Reds in Finland hoped to receive support from the new Bolshevik government in Russia. The Bolsheviks were sympathetic to socialist movements and initially provided some weapons and supplies. However, Russia itself was entering its own civil war, and the new government faced enormous challenges at home. As a result, the level of Russian support for the Finnish Reds remained limited and inconsistent. The White forces, meanwhile, gained support from Germany. At the time, Germany was still deeply involved in the First World War and saw strategic advantages in supporting anti-socialist forces in Finland. German leaders hoped that a friendly government in Finland might strengthen their influence in the Baltic region. German assistance would later prove decisive, but even before large numbers of German troops arrived, another important group joined the White Army. These were the Finnish Jaegers, volunteers who had traveled to Germany earlier during the war to receive military training. Many of them had served alongside German forces and returned to Finland with valuable combat experience. The presence of trained officers and soldiers gave the White Army a significant advantage in discipline and organization. As the weeks passed, the Whites gradually improved their coordination while continuing their push southward. The fighting itself was often chaotic and intense. Battles took place not only between organized military units, but also between local militias controlling villages and towns. Both sides established checkpoints, arrested suspected opponents, and attempted to secure loyalty in the territories they controlled. The conflict also quickly developed a harsh and violent character. Prisoners were sometimes executed, and reprisals occurred when towns changed hands. Political hatred deepened as each side viewed the other not merely as political opponents, but as threats to the survival of the nation. One of the most important early campaigns centered around the industrial city of Tampere. Located in southern Finland, Tampere was one of the largest cities in the country and a major center of working-class support for the Red Movement. Control of the city would become a crucial objective for both sides. As winter continued, the White Army moved steadily toward Tampere, preparing for what would become one of the largest and most decisive battles of the entire war. The outcome of this struggle would shape the direction of the conflict and determine whether the Reds could maintain control of southern Finland. By the spring of 1918, the Finnish Civil War had grown into a full-scale national struggle. Armed forces were mobilized across the country. Foreign powers had begun to intervene, and the political future of the young Finnish state hung in the balance. What began as political tension after independence had now become a violent contest over the identity and structure of the new nation. And as both armies prepared for larger battles in the coming weeks, Finland stood on the edge of a turning point that would decide the fate of the war. By March 1918, the Finnish Civil War had reached a decisive stage. The early weeks of scattered fighting and local clashes were giving way to larger, organized battles that would determine the outcome of the conflict. Both the Red and White forces understood that control of major cities and transportation routes would be crucial. Among these cities, none was more important than Tampere. Tampere was one of Finland's largest industrial centers and a stronghold of working-class support for the Red Movement. The city was filled with factories, railway lines, and dense urban neighborhoods. For the Red Guards, it represented not only a strategic position, but also a powerful symbol of the workers' revolution they believed they were defending. General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim and the White leadership also recognized the importance of Tampere. If the Whites could capture the city, they would weaken the Red defenses in southern Finland and gain momentum for further advances. During March 1918, White forces gradually surrounded the city, preparing for a major assault. The battle that followed became one of the most intense and destructive confrontations of the entire war. Fighting in Tampere was especially brutal because much of it took place in the streets, factories, and residential neighborhoods. Urban warfare forced soldiers to move carefully from building to building while facing gunfire from hidden positions. Both sides suffered heavy losses as the battle continued for several days. The Red defenders attempted to hold their positions, using barricades and fortified buildings to slow the White advance. However, the White Army had become increasingly organized and disciplined under Mannerheim's leadership. Their troops gradually pushed deeper into the city. By early April 1918, the Whites had captured most of Tampere. The final surrender of the Red defenders marked a turning point in the war. Thousands of Red soldiers were taken prisoner, and the loss of such an important city severely weakened the Red position across southern Finland. At the same time that the Whites were advancing from the north, Another major development was taking place along Finland's southern coast. German forces, responding to requests from the white government, launched a military expedition to support the anti-socialist side in the conflict. In early April 1918, German troops landed in southern Finland. These soldiers were well trained and equipped, and their arrival dramatically shifted the balance of power. German units quickly moved toward key coastal cities, including the capital, Helsinki. For the Red leadership, the German intervention created a new and overwhelming challenge. Their forces were already struggling to maintain control after the loss of Tampere, and now they faced a powerful foreign army advancing into their territory. As German troops moved inland, Red resistance began to collapse in several areas. Many Red fighters were poorly trained and lacked adequate supplies. Communication between different units was difficult, and coordinated defense became increasingly difficult. In April 1918, German and white forces advanced toward Helsinki. The city had been under Red control since the beginning of the uprising, but its defenses were not strong enough to resist the combined pressure. After several days of fighting, the capital fell to German and white troops. The capture of Helsinki dealt a devastating blow to the Red cause. Without control of the capital and major industrial centers, their ability to continue organized resistance weakened rapidly. Many Red fighters began retreating eastward toward the Russian border, hoping to escape capture. However, the White Army continued its advance across the remaining Red territories. Battles continued in smaller towns and rural areas as Red forces attempted to regroup. Yet the momentum of the war had clearly shifted. The combination of white military organization and German intervention made it increasingly difficult for the Reds to hold their positions. By late April 1918, the Red leadership faced a harsh reality. Their strongholds had fallen one after another, and large numbers of their soldiers were either retreating or surrendering. The dream of establishing a socialist government in Finland was fading as the war moved toward its final stage. For many civilians caught in the middle of the conflict, these weeks were filled with uncertainty and fear. Towns changed hands, prisoners were taken, and rumors spread about the fate of captured fighters. The end of the war seemed to be approaching, but the consequences of the struggle were still unfolding. As spring arrived in Finland and the snow slowly began to melt across forests and fields, the Civil War was entering its final chapter. The remaining Red forces were retreating, the White Army was consolidating control across the country, and the political future of the young Finnish state was about to be decided. By the end of April 1918, the outcome of the Finnish Civil War had become increasingly clear. The Red forces, once strong in the industrial cities of southern Finland, were now retreating in multiple directions. Their defenses had been broken by the combined advances of the White Army from the north and German troops from the south. Many Red soldiers attempted to escape eastward toward the Russian border, hoping to find safety in territory controlled by the Bolsheviks. However, the journey was difficult and dangerous. The front lines were collapsing quickly, and large numbers of Red fighters and civilians were captured during the final stages of the war. In early May 1918, the last organized Red units surrendered. After only a few months of intense fighting, the Finnish Civil War had come to an end. The White forces, led by General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, had secured control of the country. For the conservative leadership that had supported the White cause, the victory meant that Finland would not become a socialist state. Instead, the new nation would move toward a political system that preserved private property and traditional institutions while gradually building its own independent government. Yet the end of the fighting did not immediately bring peace to Finnish society. The Civil War had left deep emotional and political divisions between citizens. Communities that had once lived side by side were now separated by memories of violence, loss, and suspicion. In the weeks following the war, large numbers of Red prisoners were held in camps across Finland. Conditions in these camps were often harsh. Food shortages, disease, and overcrowding created difficult circumstances. Many prisoners remained detained for months, while authorities attempted to determine their roles in the conflict. The aftermath of the war caused thousands of additional deaths, adding to the tragedy that had already unfolded during the fighting. At the same time, many leaders and supporters of the Red Movement fled the country, seeking refuge in Soviet Russia. From there, some continued to hope that political change in Finland might one day allow them to return. Others would spend the rest of their lives in exile. For the white leadership, the challenge after the war was to stabilize the country and establish a functioning national government. Finland had only recently declared independence in 1917, and its political institutions were still developing. The trauma of civil war made this process even more complicated. In the months that followed, Finnish leaders debated what form of government the country should adopt. Some conservative groups initially supported the idea of establishing a monarchy with close ties to Germany. However, the end of the First World War later in 1918 changed the political situation across Europe. Germany's defeat removed the possibility of a German-backed monarchy in Finland. As a result, Finland gradually moved toward a republican system of government. In 1919, a new constitution was adopted, creating the Republic of Finland. The country would be governed by elected representatives and a president, establishing the democratic framework that continues today. Over time, Finland began the long process of healing the divisions created by the Civil War. Economic development resumed, industries rebuilt, and new political institutions took shape. While the memories of the conflict remained painful, many leaders worked to reduce tensions between different political groups. The Finnish Civil War lasted only a few months, but its impact was profound. It had tested the stability of a newly independent nation and forced Finns to confront deep social and political disagreements. The conflict revealed how quickly political tensions could escalate when trust between groups collapsed. Yet Finland's later history also showed the possibility of recovery. In the decades that followed, the country developed into a stable democratic state with strong social institutions and a commitment to political compromise. Though the scars of the Civil War were never entirely forgotten, the nation gradually moved toward reconciliation and shared identity. Today, historians study the Finnish Civil War not only as a military conflict, but also as an example of how political polarization, social inequality, and revolutionary ideas shaped many societies during the early 20th century. The war reflected the broader turmoil that spread across Europe after the collapse of empires and the shock of the First World War. For Finland, the events of 1918 remain an important chapter in its national story. They remind us that independence, stability, and democracy are often the result of difficult struggles. The quiet landscapes of Finland, with their forests, lakes, and long winters, once witnessed a painful conflict that helped shape the nation that exists today.